Hello, you're watching BiTV. I am Ines Berger, and today we welcome Simon Robinsohn, who is Chief Economist at RICS. Hello, Simon. Welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Hello, Ines. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Good.
So, RICS has recently conducted a global commercial market survey for the 2020 second quarter. And with you, obviously, today I would like to focus on the European markets. So, my first question is easy. What do you take away from this survey on COVID-19's impact on European commercial real estate?
Well, I mean, it is a fairly predictable response. Sentiment, which I think really until the back end of last year had been holding up pretty well in terms of commercial real estate across Europe, understandably took a bit of a tumble, and it's not really surprising. I think there was obviously a lot of concern, and there still is, about the macro implications of what's going on. But then, more specifically, of course, how that impacts real estate, how it impacts the way that tenants behave, how it impacts the way investors behave, has also had quite a significant impact, significant ramifications for the way that that market is operating.
Overall, in Europe, which markets and asset classes do you believe will recover faster from this crisis?
Well, I think there's a lot of uncertainty about the macro environment, and that inevitably, translates into challenges in terms of interpretation and as to the recovery story for commercial real estate. I think it's reasonable to assume, and this is a European story, but actually it's a global story. It's reasonable to assume that the logistics sector has more underlying strength. And indeed, some of the feedback we received around sentiment in Q2 for logistics wasn't all that negative. And part of the reason for that is the obvious one, that we're all, when lockdown, being forced to consider new, in some cases, new methods of shopping. In some cases, we're just accelerating a trend we were, or behavior we were already quite comfortable with. So there have been some winners out of this, I have to say. And I think on the back of that, it'd be reasonable to assume. But if I was looking forward 12 months, I would feel most comfortable in the logistics area. I think some of the alternatives, be it things like data centers, are also potentially likely to not only remain resilient, but show the capacity for further gains. And perhaps one or two other alternative sectors you might argue about. I don't know whether how one feels about multifamily. There's certainly positives around that, but the uncertainty about the macro dimension could weigh on that sector. What we're pretty clear on, and what comes back, not surprisingly, very emphatically, is that the troubles that retail is facing are likely to be enduring now, and that we are seeing something fairly structural, something very fundamental. And that doesn't mean that every single shopping street or shopping centre faces the same problems. They don't, but there is an issue going on here we're all aware of, and that is going to manifest itself on an ongoing basis.
How do you see the French market comparing to the European markets dealing with this crisis? And what are the strengths and the weaknesses of the market? Can you tell me more a bit about the French market?
Well, the French market, certainly as far as the feedback that we received to the survey, the French market seems to be very much slam bang in the middle of the feedback in terms of where it was and what the sort of mood music is, and the expectations. And I suppose this does reflect that sort of broader European macro dimension. If I was to say a market that stood out in contrast to that mass, it probably was Germany. Germany, I think, was able to maintain a degree of resilience, certainly in terms of the feedback that we got. And I suppose that reflects some sort of confidence about the economic performance. But, there's, obviously a lot going on, not just in terms of individual country macro behaviors, but obviously that wider European dimension. So, for example, the idea of working together as a European entity to provide that fiscal budgetary funding to help support weaker economies. Now, I think that's something that is, ultimately quite a positive for Europe, and by implication, I would suggest it's positive for France, because it's not, it's the opposite of being disruptive. It's not disruptive in the way that, we could, the macro environment could have turned without that support. But I think in terms of how that plays out specifically and how the wider issues play out specifically in terms of the French market, well, I think that, clearly ongoing issues around COVID are more prevalent in some countries than others. We know that there have been some issues in parts of France. It's not alone in that environment, but it is, one of those where there is an issue. And I think that is going to be an ongoing concern, for real estate markets, full stop. And, obviously in the case of the question you asked, it is going to be a drag on the French market. And I think that really feeds into the expectations we're seeing for France, which are still that on a 12-month view, capital values in aggregate probably are going to be lower than where they are now, and similarly rents. So I don't sense from our French respondents that there's any great optimism about market recovery. And I think that the other thing that's interesting, I suppose, is that, the market is still viewed as being quite expensive. That isn't uncommon in Europe, because the markets were expensive. I suppose they had got to that point, but I think it is still viewed as expensive. It's viewed as being in the downturn phase of a cycle, not surprisingly, but there doesn't seem to be sort of much visibility as how that recovery at a headline level pulls through. I do make again the exception, highlight the exception of areas like logistics, which again is showing much greater resilience.
Thank you for joining us today, Simon.
Thank you very much for having me.
See you soon on BiTV.